delivered delivery numbers that were well short of estimates. The shares, of course, have been down as much as 6%. Losses adding to the stock's big drop in the first quarter, of course, when, the shares were down as much as 35%. Our next guest says, well, it wasn't a good quarter. I want to get to Dan Ives and everything he's got to say. Of course, longtime bull on the stock. From Wedbush Securities, Managing Director of Equity Research. Dan, I'm reading your report, which you wrote very quickly. Let's call it as it is. While we were anticipating a bad quarter, this was an unmitigated disaster. First quarter deliveries was a nightmare quarter for Tesla, you wrote. Elon is now pressured by the street, and China demand remains very soft. And you also say, in this case, street criticism is warranted. But then I end, and you still have an outperform rating, and I wonder why.
Hey, look, I mean, for the long term, like in terms of the actual opportunity for EV, for full self-driving, for autonomous, that's still there. But let's just call it like it is. This is no smoke and mirror. I mean, if you looked up train wreck in the dictionary, you'd see a picture of Tesla's 1Q quarter. And, I think the big problem is deliveries. How do you reverse the trend? And that's why I believe this is a fork in the road. In other words, Musk either turns this around, whether it's cutting prices, put the strategy in place, or David, I think we sit here maybe 3-4 quarters from now, and this was actually a seminal moment and the start of what could be some darker days ahead if they do not turn this around.
All right, but what does the turnaround look like? You say cutting prices. Clearly, they're facing more competition from Chinese EV makers, not just in the domestic Chinese market. So what do you do if you're Tesla?
I think you have to lay out the strategy. Okay, what are price cuts going to look like? When are the new models coming? What could software be as a percent of revenue? What's the AI roadmap? Right now, it's essentially playing darts blindfolded. You don't really have an adult in the room. The conference calls, as we've talked about here, have really been horror shows. So investors, they're hoping in terms of that, what's on the other side of this. Now, in terms of the growth, the opportunity, $30 billion in cash, they're in a phenomenal position from that perspective. But I'd say, probably this is what I'd say in the last 5 years, probably the darkest period relative to what we're seeing in China. And this quarter, exclamation mark.
All right, but you talk about, the hope of investors. You still clearly have hope as well. So what do you base your hope on? You've been, the last 2 minutes here, you've been quite negative.
Mm-hmm. It's that we're 3-4% of automobiles are EVs. Is that full self-driving autonomous? You could argue that could be $1 trillion worth of value from a software perspective. The China story, you've seen the price cuts start to stabilize. They had a good week of the last quarter. So there are some optimism, and I still believe you could be toward 2 million units for the year. But this quarter, there's just no way to sort of glass half full it. This is one where even whisper numbers called 415K. 386, a disaster.
So is it supply or demand? Because we expected some production setbacks in the first quarter.
I think supply would be dog ate the homework. Maybe call it 30K. You could explain that in a press release. But realistically, it's demand. And I think the problem here, Sarah, is that, okay, you're either going to cut prices or ultimately, you're going to hold serve and then focus on what you could actually do, but hold margins and where volumes could go. The problem is that you can't just put one toe in the water. In other words, what's the strategy? How are you going to reverse
And do you know how much of it is China? Can you tell?
Well, we believe China's down, called 3%, potentially 4% year over year. China was supposed to be up 2-3%. You look at Xiaomi, you look at other automobiles that are coming out that we talked about it. It's probably negative as I've seen in China in years when we were in the region. But the Tesla growth story is still there. In other words, we're still in the early innings of where this can go. But just like we've seen, whether it was Cook, whether we've seen Nadella, you have to navigate and walk investors through these white knuckle moments. Otherwise, I can tell you from phone calls I'm getting right after this, investors want to be like, okay, what's the hope? What can we hang our hat on?
Yeah, it's not clear to me that Musk is going to be the guy to do that for you.
Well, the problem is ever since Zach, CFO, left, the calls have almost been comedy shows in a bad way. You need to actually give guidance, give the strategy, and then investors, they could agree or disagree. But right now, that blindfolded darts is not the way to go.
But you just said you still think they could hit 2 million.
100%. But lay out the strategy, they didn't even give guidance on the call. Give a range. Give some targets. You can't just have flying blind. And I think that's the issue here. With a quarter like this is a fork in the moment. This is for Musk. You either navigate it, this was a rallying cry, and I believe we sit here and it was a buying opportunity on the other side. But if you don't navigate investors through it with a quarter like this, it's going to be tough.
All right. Dan, I know we're going to continue the conversation, but certainly appreciate you stopping by today. Thank you. Dan Ives.
Well, Tesla's part of the story, but we've got a big sell-off on our hands here. The Dow's down about 433 points. 182 points of that loss is United Healthcare. These health insurers are getting slammed today. It's not just them. Humana, CVS Health, after this Medicare Advantage rate announcement came in less than expected. But if you look at the bottom of the Dow, besides that, it's Microsoft, Amgen, Salesforce, Home Depot. Tech is selling off. We've got NVIDIA weighing on the triple Qs, for instance, as well as Microsoft and Tesla. Still to come, Disney reportedly pulling ahead in its proxy battle against Nelson Peltz with more than half of shares voted. We're going to bring you the very latest next when Squawk on the Street comes right back.